If I could, if you're getting a sandwich, would you please grab your sandwich and then take a seat? We have a pretty full group of people here today, which I'm presuming is in honor of our guest speaker. Okay. As those of you that have attended these events before know, we're going to do a little bit of business before we introduce our guest speaker. My name is Gary Breton. I am president of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and on behalf of the council, I'd like to welcome you here to today's Instant Issues Luncheon event. We're very, very pleased to have our guest speaker with us today, who will be introduced shortly. On the business side, first and most importantly, somebody handed me a parking ticket that somebody dropped out by the reception area. And if this is yours, you're going to need it. Otherwise, you're going to have to pay full price when you try to get out of the garage. So if it's yours, you can see Sid Melcher, our executive director, and she will give it to you.
It says 11:30 on it.
It says 11:30
So
on
if you
it?
got in here early at 11:30.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Okay. Sponsors. For those of you that have been here before, you know that we're unable to put these things on unless we have sponsors. We're very, very grateful to the sponsors of our Instant Issues Luncheon, which are Signoli and Company, represented by Tony Signoli, who is on our board of directors. Wilbraham and Munson Academy, Rod Lebrecht, who is not here today, but who's head of school, is also on our board. Prosperity Candle, and our media sponsor is Business West. Board members today who are present and continue to support the council on an ongoing basis. Immediate past President Ken First, his wife Karen, John Years, who's also a former president, Sue Root, who's a former executive director, Rich Redeker, who I did not see here today, Jeremy Cole, who is doing our videotaping back there. Thank you, Jeremy. Seth Stratton, who I also did not see, but hopefully will be here, John Young, and Kathleen Plant. Thank you to our board members. I also wanted to acknowledge our guest speaker today's Chief of Staff, Lauren Corcoran, is here with us, along with the District Director, James Warren. Thank you for attending very much. Thank you. We also just recently completed, a week ago Saturday, our 2014 Academic World Quest competition. That is a high school competition where we have high school teams from the area who compete in basically a test, I guess, of their knowledge of international and cultural affairs. This year's competition, which I believe was our ninth, was won by Wilbraham and Munson Academy. We have several members of that group here today, and the winning team is sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts to go to Washington at the end of April to compete in the national competition. I believe we have Emily Zeno, Brian Popovich, and Danielle Bellefeu here today. Welcome on behalf of the council. Also, I would like to recognize the sponsors of the Academic World Quest competition because it costs money to send these students to Washington, along with their coach and an alternate. I'd like to thank my law firm of Bacon & Wilson, who stepped up this year. Also, Wilbraham Munson Academy, who not only contributed dollars, but also the site, the venue for the event. Redeker Software, and also Charista Construction, who I believe is represented today by Mary Beth Bergeron. Mary Beth, where are you? Thank you very much. Okay, a couple plugs. One, membership. If you are not a member of the council, and I had the opportunity of meeting a gentleman on the way in who just joined the council, please consider joining. The cost for membership is relatively cheap. We've been around for 90 years. We'd like to be around for 90 more, carrying on our mission. So please grab a membership pamphlet on the way out and consider joining. Upcoming events, programs on your table. You have these brightly colored yellow sheets, which Sid Melcher has an affinity for, our executive director. After today's presentation by our guest speaker, on Thursday, February 13th, we have Mr. Akira Muto. He is the Japanese Consul General in Boston. He will be speaking to us. He will be speaking to us on Abenomics and Governor Deval Patrick's mission to Japan. On Sunday, February 23rd, there will be a closing ceremony watch party for the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, which are being hosted by Gale and Rich Rediker, who are members of the council. Rich is a board member, and they graciously allow us to use their home to have social gatherings, and they're usually a lot of fun, so please consider attending. Also on February 25th, we have our newest Adventures in International Dining. This is something that we've been doing for the last year and a half or so. Where's John and Meg? And it's a wonderful event. We're usually limited to about 30 people or so. This particular adventure is going to be up at the King and I restaurant on Boston Road in Wilbraham. And it will be featuring Thai and Laotian cuisine. So if you're interested, look on the website or talk to Sid Melcher, who coordinates everything council-ish. Also on Wednesday, February 26th, we have Father Warren Savage, who I actually attended high school with, who is a lecturer at Elms College, and he will be speaking on the Pope as a world leader. I think that will be exceptionally interesting. And finally, on April 24th, we have Mr. Mike Bond. He is both an activist and an author, and he will be speaking on The Last Savannah, Animal Poaching in Africa. So please, consider coming to these events to support us, and quite frankly, you get to learn an awful lot, at least I do. Okay, our program today, we are very, very pleased, because she is an exceptionally busy woman, to have Gale Candaras, who as an attorney has a 20-year record of exemplary public service to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and to the residents of Hampden County. Prior to her election in the Massachusetts State Senate, representing the 1st Hampden and Hampshire District, Gale represented Wilbraham, Springfield, and East Longmeadow for 10 years as state representative for the 12th Hampden District, which is the largest district in the state and of which I am a resident. In February of 2012, Senator Candaras was appointed by Senate President Therese Murray to chair the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies. She also serves as vice chair of the Joint Committee on the Judiciary and sits on the Joint Committees on Financial Services, Ways and Means, and Transportation, as well as the Senate Committee on Post-Audit and Oversight, Ways and Means, and Global Warming and Climate Change. She is a longtime member and friend of the World Affairs Council. She has served as the moderator of our 2000 Academic World Quest competition, so she's intimately familiar with that, and has met with people from China, Afghanistan, and Nigeria who are interested in state and local government, who visit our area through the United States State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program. Gale will be speaking to us today about human trafficking in Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Senator Gale Candaras.
Thank you, Gary. Gary Breton and I were actually in law school together about 100 years ago. Sorry. So I've been asked to speak today about human trafficking, and I was told I had about 50 minutes, but I want you to know that I am going to stay for a while afterwards to answer questions. There's an awful lot of information to be had here, and I want to thank you very much for inviting me here today. The Scottish poet Robert Burns, in his funeral dirge poem of 1784, talked about man's inhumanity to man. That was the first time, actually, that statement ever appeared documented. And as I prepared these remarks, I couldn't help but think about man's inhumanity to man and to woman and about anybody who is poor and vulnerable. I thought about this age-old expression and how overwhelming is the scope and scale of the problem of human trafficking, which is growing exponentially around the globe as businesses worldwide seek cheap labor to remain competitive. But understanding the mechanics of human trafficking is essential to protect, if not stop, the victimization of people who inevitably are the most powerless among us: women, children, the young, the poor, the economically and politically powerless, the victims of war and genocide caught up in vast migrations fleeing across the world's border. January is Human Trafficking Month, so today's event could not be more timely in terms of highlighting the plight of millions of victims. And I thank the World Affairs Council, Sid Melcher and Gary Breton. And this room is full of friends, people I've known for years. So I'm so glad you all came today to listen to me speak. You've been listening to me speak a very long time. Elliot Stratton listened to me speak in the courts for about 100 years. So hi, Elliot. How are you? Lots of Wilbraham folks here as well. Slavery, exploitation, forced labor, servitude, sexual exploitation, and even forced organ donation, which I will not talk about at lunchtime. These are but a few of the words used to describe what we refer to nowadays as human trafficking, but the common threads of human trafficking, that is control, abuse, servitude, slavery, torture, have been part of human civilization and cultures in every culture from time immemorial. Throughout history, many wars were fought over the theft of women and children, forced labor, indentured servitude. In fact, the most catastrophic war, as you all know, in American history, was the Civil War. And there were 620,000 casualties, the most casualties of any war in American history, which was fought over slavery. I was asked today specifically to talk about the law we passed here in Massachusetts. We passed a law in Massachusetts last year at the request basically of the Attorney General. The Attorney General and law enforcement in general was relying in Massachusetts on the federal law in order to prosecute. And oftentimes the federal government chose not to prosecute cases the Attorney General wanted to prosecute. The federal government either didn't have the resources to prosecute particular cases, or they had bigger fish to fry. So the Attorney General felt there were a lot of cases where relief should be and redress should be sought, but it wasn't happening. So before I go into that, into our passage of the 2011 law, I want to set the stage for why human trafficking is growing exponentially and why it is becoming such a major problem. I already gave some of the hints. The downturn in the economy, the past 8 years, has seen human trafficking grow exponentially worldwide. Emerging markets has also resulted in a growth in human trafficking. Imagine that people in their countries were used to growing and producing the resources of that country for internal use. And they all had jobs doing that, and they had jobs doing that for generations. Emerging markets means that those countries look to do business globally. And the next thing that happened is mega corporations started coming into those countries to exploit those resources. So now goods and services and products that were used solely for the benefit of, and farmed solely for the benefit of the population, were now shifting. That whole paradigm was shifting, and those products were now going to be for export. And big corporations came into those countries, and they started doing business with subcontractors. And the next thing that happened was the folks who had been doing it for generations were out of jobs and were being trafficked. And so emerging markets, the downturn in the economy, the vast migrations of people that we talked about, war, natural disasters, all of the terrible things we see happening around the world, which displace and dislocate enormous populations of people who then start trying to flee or immigrate across borders. And sometimes they're not able to do that. So they're caught in a terrible situation. They're out of their culture, they're out of their homes, they're out of their villages. These folks are very vulnerable, and oftentimes human traffickers target these people, as you might expect they would. But both the Massachusetts statute goes beyond the federal statute in some very important ways. It changes the dialogue, and it changes the prosecution and the theory of prosecution around prostitution, which really has not been taken all that seriously under the federal law, has not been addressed as human trafficking, has not been included in the definition of human trafficking as such. Prostitution in this country basically has been treated as a victimless crime, even when the folks involved were under the age of consent, which is 16. And oftentimes the prostitutes were prosecuted. And these are folks overwhelmingly, well, many of them children, many of them 13, 14 years old, who are homeless, who are hungry, who are prostituting themselves because they're under duress or coercion. Folks think that trafficking involves always foreigners and foreign nationals, and people, the victims or the folks trafficked, are always folks from other countries. Not true. Not true at all. Massachusetts is not a hotbed of human trafficking at this time. There are pockets of it in other parts of the state. We passed the law in 2011, and it's very hard at this time because we haven't quite yet developed the statistics. We don't have the infrastructure for the statistics. But I will start with the fact that both sex workers, domestic workers, farm workers, and labor trafficking of United States citizens and foreign nationals occurs across the Commonwealth every single day. It's underground, you might not see it, but it is happening here. In 2011, the Massachusetts legislature, in order to respond to the increasing number of victims in the Commonwealth and to provide greater tools to combat the problem and to assist law enforcement and victims, enacted what we call an act relative to the commercial exploitation of people, otherwise known as the Massachusetts Trafficking Statute. So this is 2011, and this is now January of 2014. Prior to enactment of the statute, Massachusetts was one of only 3 states, including West Virginia and Wyoming, which had not expressly criminalized human trafficking. We're leaders in everything else. For whatever reasons, we chose to rely upon the federal law. So this was becoming a problem. One of only 3 states in the nation without its own criminal human trafficking law. We had relied exclusively on the federal law and federal resources to prosecute crimes. The Massachusetts statute became law in 2012 and created new human trafficking related offenses under state law and provides a civil remedy for relief by which victims of trafficking may seek recourse, typically in the form of damages, independently for the crimes committed against them. If you're not a lawyer, what I am saying to you is that under our statute, which is unique in this regard, individual victims are allowed private claims for relief. That means they may sue in court for damages against the traffickers. So they don't just have to rely upon the state prosecuting the traffickers and seeking justice that way. They can also seek damages. As regards prostitution, our Massachusetts statute also created a defense for adult prostitutes who can establish that prostitution-related offenses were committed under duress or coercion, and it provides a safe harbor against prosecution for children under 18 accused of those offenses. So for the first time in Massachusetts, these folks are going to be treated as victims. If you are a prostitute, you are going to be treated as a victim. This law gives state officials the ability to prosecute trafficking crimes the federal authorities may not take up. Again, the federal authorities are, have 50 states to deal with. They choose which cases they want to prosecute. The rest of them go without redress. We passed this law so that won't happen, so our Attorney General and our district attorneys can prosecute cases more broadly than what the federal government is able to do. The statute also focuses on victim support, and we have put in place a structure, which I'll discuss in a few minutes, to try to help these people so that they're not back on the street again. I think we all know that there is a tremendous problem with homeless youth, not just around the United States, but here in Massachusetts as well. The legislation established new crimes of human trafficking for sexual servitude and forced labor, enticement of a child by means of electronic communication, and organ trafficking. Each crime includes penalties along with lengthened prison terms if the victim is under 18 years old. the internet is a serious problem in terms of identifying perpetrators of human trafficking and also in terms of protecting young people from these traffickers. These traffickers know exactly how to manipulate the internet for this purpose. And I'm going to digress for a minute. I learned recently that our district attorney has an entire part of his office where they have state police who are expert in going online and identifying people who are targeting children for purposes of sexual contact. It's really amazing how they're able to do it. But the resources are simply not there to do it in large enough size to deal with what's actually going on the internet. It's really amazing. In addition, the legislation increased penalties for solicitation of prostitution and engaging in sex for a fee. In addition to establishing new crimes, the legislation made 4 other significant changes to the general laws. The law now requires mandated reporters to report victims of human trafficking. Mandated reporters include school personnel, law enforcement, as well as medical service providers and social services. Training is being developed to increase awareness among mandated reporters to recognize trafficking and understand the resources available to assist victims. It's very interesting because many times poor women and children who have been trafficked are taken to doctors and taken to emergency rooms. And there are signs that this is a trafficked individual, and educating medical personnel and educating other service providers in school to recognize a trafficked victim. I mentioned before Elliot Stratton is here. Elliot and I worked many years ago on care and protection cases, and we have a system here in Massachusetts of mandated reporters for abused children. It's a process called 51A. Well, when we were looking to do this type of report, we looked at that process and we thought, well, school teachers are mandated reporters for child abuse, hospital workers, social workers, there's a whole litany of people who are mandated reporters under Chapter 51A, who have a duty if they see a child or a young person who's being abused to report it to DCF, to the police. We wanted to replicate that system, and we had the system in place. So expanding the system to create mandated reporters who in large measure were already there, but train them to recognize human trafficking victims. And so that's something the legislation does as well. So the statute requires that the DCF, Department of Children and Families, which was DSS, must also assess whether a child has been sexually exploited and create a plan to protect the child. Now I say that, but if you've seen the news recently, you know how difficult what a difficult time DCF is having meeting the needs for people already in the system. And you see what the governor is doing and the governor's response to that. And there's going to be serious efforts at reforming that system. But the legislation creates the Victims of Human Trafficking Trust Fund, which we created to hold the forfeited assets of traffickers and to distribute those assets to victims. Finally, our law mandated the creation of the Massachusetts Interagency Human Trafficking Policy Task Force, which is the first such task force of its kind in the United States. It's chaired by the Massachusetts Attorney General. Its purpose is to address all aspects of human trafficking. We pass a law. It's not going to be a law for all time. The world is way too dynamic. The law is way too dynamic for that. We're in a world where everything is changing, the ground is shifting under our feet all the time. And again, I make specific reference to what's happening globally on the internet. And now with every country in the nation, basically, folks who want it can get it, internet access, the ability for human traffickers and criminals basically to prey upon vulnerable populations that are in crisis, trying to flee because of human disaster, war, pestilence, famine, natural disasters, whatever's going on there. Their ability to identify where these populations are and to victimize them is something we've never seen before. It's quite extraordinary. So the Attorney General and this task force is now going to watch this situation, and we're going to have to provide solutions as time goes forward. We're going to have to find solutions to meet new challenges and not just pass a law and the law's there for 10 years and it doesn't meet the needs anymore. Excuse me. The task force, which met formally, just in case you're wondering what that task force did, has already met formally 9 times from February 12, 2012 through August 2013. It's comprised of representatives from 19 different organizations, including mandated members from state agencies and gubernatorial appointments in the areas of victim services and academia. The task force divided into subcommittees which established the recommendations by subject area. So the task force has subcommittees on victim services, demand reduction, data collection, information sharing, education and training, and public awareness. On August 19, 2013, the task force released a report with recommended changes in state policy to better support programs for victims, such as making victims eligible to receive state benefits and assistance by granting them federal visa protection so that they could stay in this country and not have to be returned back home where the traffickers are threatening to kill them and kill their families. The task force also found that constraints due to the limited number of organizations to support victims and the lack of financial resources to assist survivors of trafficking are primary impediments to effectively addressing traffickers. If all you're going to do is send people back to the environments where they came, instead of providing them asylum, instead of providing them resources, instead of providing them with a way to be self-sufficient, then basically you're not helping them. You're just signing their death warrants. The immediate needs include, for a trafficked individual, include establishing a safe house, a home pilot project to develop a statewide first offender program for all people arrested for buying sex. So these are your Johns. These are the people that are on the demand side of it, and at least giving them an opportunity the first time out to not be incarcerated. We were told that there is what is called a Johns School here in Hampden County, the address of which is unknown even to me. The idea is on a first arrest, these individuals are sent to this particular Johns School for an entire day, and they are taught and educated to the fact that they are victimizing these people who've already been victimized, and understanding that these women are not consenting to sex, that these people are operating under coercion and duress, whether it is a huge cartel trafficking them or whether it is just a collection of individuals they call pimps trafficking them. These people are operating under duress. They're doing this for survival. This is not Hollywood. This is not glamorous. These are not movie star call girls. These are poverty-stricken women, often from homes, and poverty-stricken, homeless young people, oftentimes coming from long histories of sexual and physical and emotional abuse. And that's why they're there. And that's what the Johns School does. It helps to educate them about what it is actually is going on and what they're doing when they buy services, and where the money actually goes when they go to these so-called sex workers. So there is that pilot collection. We're also, the law talks about a coordinated data collection response across the state. And another major part of this is to educate and train law enforcement, educate and train police. Their education and their training around the issue of prostitution and what prostitution is. Training healthcare providers, again, first responders, victim service providers, and finally, increase public awareness about the issue and change public perception to support the reduction in crime. I think I said before that our district attorney, Mark Mastroianni, in reviewing and working with the law since 2011, said one of the most important aspects of the law is that the way it's drafted, it will change the dialogue. It will change the way people think around the issue of prostitution and sex workers And we do have these problems here in Western Massachusetts. You see every once in a while, certainly those of you here in law enforcement know that. Every once in a while you'll see these stings, these prostitution stings. DCF knows it because they round up very young people, oftentimes under the age of consent, oftentimes under 16. There's issues with massage parlors here in Western Massachusetts that are really fronts for sex worker activity. So there are problems. There are problems here. There are also trafficked individuals who are used for domestic use. This is a major problem nationally as people come here, wealthy and moneyed people from other countries come here. It is not uncommon for them to seek to buy trafficked individuals. It is nothing extraordinary in their countries for them to have slaves, and even if their countries have banned it, it's still the custom to, in fact, have slaves in your home. Oftentimes they're very, very young children. I don't know whether you saw the New York Times article, and I think it was Nicholas, I can tell you exactly,
Christoph.
Nicholas Fillon.
Christoph?
Well, I have it. That may be the name, but it was a New York Times article over the holidays about the 13-year-old girl from Haiti. Haiti has become a hotbed for human trafficking. It was always a problem there, but in light of the tremendous devastation from the earthquake, it is now really one of the hotbeds in the world, along with China. You see the Chinese economy, and you've been watching the market, you know what's happening in China and the fears it's engendering globally. China is now a hotbed for human trafficking. Anytime you see huge populations of poor people with no government support, no government resources, and folks who are desperate to get out of their country, these are people who oftentimes, young people who are oftentimes told that they are going to be hired to work. I think one young woman was told she was going to work down in a beach resort for the summer, and then she'd be able to go back to her job in Ukraine, go back to college in Ukraine. I don't know, did anyone see the MSNBC special last night on human trafficking? Well, it was really quite extraordinary, but this particular group of human traffickers identified young women who were college students in Russia and wanted to come in Ukraine, and who wanted to come here for the summer to work in resort areas as servers because they understood that those folks made pretty good money. And so they signed up to do this, and they were brought to this country, and within hours of being brought to this country, they were beaten and forced into prostitution as sex workers, and they were, locked away from the world for forever. They weren't allowed out. They were transported, and they were not allowed to go back to Ukraine. And they were told if they complained, their families back in the Ukraine would be murdered. So, and what was interesting about the piece last night was, I know Attorney Breton will appreciate this, and so will Attorney Kane. The defense was the women could have left any time.
Yeah, right.
Well, you're a defense lawyer. You got to give it your best shot, and it wasn't really a very good defense. But anyway, there's a lot of information out there about human trafficking. At this time, again, it is very difficult to quantify the full extent of the problem or the impact of the passage of our trafficking law in Massachusetts in 2011 due to the newness and the lack of experience with the law, as well as to prior constraints on data collection and information. Because, first of all, every state has its own computer system. I don't have to tell you what's going on with the government's efforts to communicate with its citizens by computer. At least you see the paper, so it's the healthcare law, right? The computer efforts there have not been so great. I guess we've got the same folks trying to do the work here in the Commonwealth, and our problems are great as well.
Why did we hire the same company?
I can tell you that I didn't hire them, and based upon what I know of them now, I would never have hired them. And all I can say is they must have given a great interview. David, I don't know. You're a former state rep. You know how this shakes out.
Yes, indeed.
So obviously a terrible mistake. They did come into my office and they did try to defend themselves, and you know, it all became a matter of, well, that we weren't hired to do that piece of it. We were only hired to do this piece of it, and you know, by the time they get done talking, you know you're going to need a 3-month trial and about 100 witnesses. So I just want to say that we are trying to work on the data collection piece. But the other problem is victims don't want to talk about what's happened to them. They have been threatened with death of their families and their children. They came here to work to send money back to their country of origin to feed their starving families, and now they're going to be told that one wrong move and they're going to kill their starving families back there. And these folks have the present ability to do that. These traffickers are in country where the people from which the people were trafficked, and they have the ability to go into that village and kill that family. So it is coercion and duress. So again, the problem is data collection and how we're going to do that. We do know, however, that a majority of the victims in Massachusetts are U.S. citizens. The concern that we have, however, is the huge number of farms, the tobacco farms and all the farms from Connecticut and Massachusetts all the way to the Vermont border. There is a huge number of farm workers, agricultural workers, who come up here every picking season from South America and Latin America. And we know that. And we know that you never see them. You don't see them anywhere. But Joan Kagan, who runs Square One, has an enormous federal grant. And there are virtually dozens and dozens of infants delivered to Square One at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning during picking season. And she takes care of all of the children who would otherwise be in the fields with their parents. So we know these people are here. They're living in attics, they're living in basements, but they're almost invisible. They're kept invisible. Many of those folks, we believe, sign up with these folks to be transported on rickety buses up from Latin America and South America. We don't know whether they're here willingly or what the circumstances are. There are populations of people who are invisible to us at this time, who cannot be heard. And these situations have to be ferreted out and investigated. And that's hopefully what some of our law will do. It will enable local law enforcement to prosecute where previously they had to rely upon the feds, the federal government, to do it. There are resource centers that you can contact. I'm going to give you a hotline. You know that there were 3 women in Cleveland who were imprisoned in a home for years, for decades. From time to time, people would see one of the women through a window, but they never saw them outside and nobody did anything about it. People don't want to get involved. They're fearful of retribution. There is a hotline where you can call if you suspect that someone is being trafficked. I'll give you an example of how that happened. There was a family, I won't say where, there was a family, I'm told it was Western Massachusetts. They were from another country where predominantly India and Pakistan, where a lot of these folks come over here, and some of them, you know, had slaves or had indentured servants back there. And so from time to time, people in the neighborhood would go into the house for whatever reasons, would see an 8-year-old child who was really of a different ethnicity. And the child wasn't in school and nobody said anything about it. And finally, one of the neighbors was in the house at one point and got a fleeting glimpse of an 8-year-old girl ironing at 11 o'clock in the morning. And she called authorities, and this was a child who was trafficked as a household servant. It's very, very common. The story I started to tell you about the New York Times was of just such a child who was 10 years old, and her father, this was from Haiti, her father had, and Karen first is shaking her head yes. Do you all know this story? Some of you do not. So the father had 12 children and was unable to feed this child. He sold this child. To a family, and she would go there and she would be household help. And the family said to the father, "We will make sure she is fed and that she goes to school." The child, who's 10 years old, arrives and in the home of the owners now of the child, and she is beaten every single day. And yes, she has some food, and yes, she does go to school a few hours, but her life is fairly, it's misery. It's a human rights violation. She is saved by an organization, and she is returned from a safe house to her parents in the village, and they're not happy to see her. They don't want her back. The fact that she was beaten every day is certainly not what they desired for the child, but at least she was being fed, and at least she was getting to go to school, which is a better life than she would have had she'd stayed in that village. What a choice, right? What a choice. And I will tell you the other thing that I think happened, and then I will conclude unless you have questions. When we started outsourcing corporations, or allowing them to outsource, obviously they have the right to do that to other companies, the argument was that they needed to do that for cheaper labor markets. They couldn't compete in the global economy where labor in other countries was so cheap. And so that started some of it a little bit with the ethic, the business ethic of pursuing not quality products, but pursuing the cheapest labor you can. And the consumers are complicit in this. We're all complicit in this. And the way we're complicit in this is because we have an identity of interests with these corporations, be they American corporations or foreign corporations, whether they're doing business over there or they're doing business here. We all want to buy products at absolutely the cheapest cost we can, the lowest price we can. And I guess that's maybe human nature. I guess the question that is presented ultimately is, are we going to be willing to pay $10 more for this so that the people who are producing it can have decent lives, so that we're not going to have the kind of replay of the shirtwaist triangle fire in New York at the turn of the century that we just had in Korea? We're going to have to look at our conduct on the supply side and the demand side, because as long as we have this identity of interest with corporations where they want to produce a product as cheaply as possible and are willing to do almost anything to do it, and we want to buy products as cheaply as possible because we all know we need 40 of these, right? I gotta have 40 of these and I have to have them, at half price. So there's a lot of issues on the supply and demand side with human trafficking. But again, it's not just factories, it's domestic help, it's agriculture, it's sex workers, and again, I mentioned ever so briefly, there's new frontiers in sex trafficking and human trafficking, and that's on the issue of organs, which we're not going to get into today. So there's a lot of resources I have available for you. The Polaris Center, Polaris Center, Gary knows it. Polaris, the new North Star, which guided the slaves in the Underground Railroad. Well, 2 young college women, I think from Smith, formed this organization. They do a lot of tracking of human trafficking violations. So nail salons are becoming a big source of trafficking, and you have to watch that too. I want to give you the hotline number. I have cut my remarks probably into about a third. How am I doing on time? Poorly? 4 minutes? Okay. I want to talk just briefly about some things that have happened where folks were able to interfere and did interfere and saved people. Last week, a man and a woman in Fall River, Massachusetts, again, they're having some more of these problems. Fall River, New Bedford, southeastern Mass. It's not quite here yet, at least not that we know, not that we see, but I think we'd be foolish to think it's not coming our way, given that we have a major drug and gun corridor here on I-91, one of the worst in the nations, and given what we've all just discussed, that human trafficking in terms of profitability for these crime operations worldwide will now exceed, in 10 years, human trafficking will be more profitable than gun and drug trafficking combined. So this is on our doorstep, and it's coming our way, and we have to know how to fight it. So last week, a man and woman in Fall River were arrested for trafficking by arranging for adults to have sex with minor children in the Fall River area. Their apprehension was a joint operation between state, federal, and local law enforcement agencies. The Attorney General's office, which is prosecuting the case under the Massachusetts statute, found out about the case when the New Bedford police received an anonymous tip from a citizen. So there's an operation going on in New Bedford. This man and this woman are trafficking children for purposes of supplying them for sexual purposes to adults in that area. Somebody got wind of it and somebody called the hotline, and the New Bedford police were able to save these children because of that. You'd be surprised the things you see in your everyday lives, and maybe you go home and you play the tape again and you think to yourself, you know, something about that just didn't look right. It just didn't look right to me. That's the time when you have to pick up the phone and call, and you shouldn't hesitate. If it's okay, it's okay. Nobody's going to be prosecuted. But if there's something wrong, you may save somebody's life. Another case that happened last summer, a developmentally disabled teenager met a man on the internet and later met him in person at the Medfield, Massachusetts library. He intended to sell her into slavery, and he lured her to leave with him. Again, this was anonymous tip. Somebody in the library saw them together and looked at the situation and said, this doesn't look right. This young woman, you know, doesn't look like she has full capacity to determine whether or not she should be with this man. And this man just looks way too old to be with this woman. You know, there are young women that go missing every day, and we heard on the television just a couple of nights ago that the mother of a young woman who's gone missing is hoping that she's still alive and that she may have been taken for purposes of trafficking, and that someday they'll see her again. And that when you're a mother and you're in that circumstance and that's the best you can hope for, that's a pretty sad case. I am going to look some more. I have a lot of information on the Polaris project. I have a lot of information on the hotline. The hotline number, and if you give my staff your email, I will send you a lot more information. I have all of the information on the treaty. 159 countries have signed on to the treaty to try and end human trafficking. I have all of that for you if you want me to send it to you. Again, I have vast amounts of information for you. So the hotline number is the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, and I'll give you the number if you want it, 1-888-373-7888. And these folks will take your concerns anonymously. So if you see something that just, a lot of us have gut instincts. We'll look at a situation and we know it's wrong. So thank you very much for inviting me. I could have and would have talked all day, but none of you would have allowed me to do that. And so I'll take any questions. I talked about Ken first. Karen first, okay.
Let me do this story for everybody because I just have to get it off my chest, and I think it might just touch everybody. And thank you to everyone in this room who's done something about this. About 10 years ago, our company was asked to do a video for the homeless for Mercy Medical Center. And we went to do the video, and they had found 5 young women who were willing to tell their story. And the first one I walked up to how are you? And she said, well, I may have to leave because my baby. I said, your baby? How old are you? She's 13. I got the story from her. We're talking about 14 blocks from here, maybe, right? She was offered a pill when she turned 13 to help her lose weight. The pill was not a pill, it was cocaine. She had to turn 5 tricks a day to pay for her drug habit. Now that's right 14 blocks are here from wherever it is. Here's a girl on the street with a baby right here. It's not just about far away. It happens right here.
It's happening.
And telling that story still gives me the chills.
Right. It's happening.
You mentioned the commission as part of the new legislature. Is there education, is there an option for education in there about companies in our area who buy product from, very specifically, trying to make sure they buy the least expensive way they can get things manufactured and then sold? I mean, years ago, Walmart was, they actively advocating having their products made in China, and no one could sell to a Walmart distributor unless they manufactured in China, and most of that was slave labor or prison labor. And I don't think that's talked about enough. I don't think enough people understand the implications of purchasing from places like that or others. So I think
I just saw a big article on that because they did a thing on public television, I think, about the slave labor in China and being, they call them re-education centers. And you're supposed to go to one, meanwhile they send you to a factory to work for the state. I don't know too much about the Walmart case, but I can tell you something. I chair the Women's Caucus in Massachusetts and in Boston, among other things. And we have a special initiative about the rare earth minerals, and trying to ensure that Massachusetts corporations, you know, Massachusetts makes a lot of computers and cell phones and lots of other things like that. And a lot of the folks who are mining those minerals are slaves. And not only are there slaves mining those minerals, but then these rebel troops steal them and take them across the borders where they use them for, you know, funding their revolt, funding their, and who knows in these countries whether who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. I don't know. Linda Fuller goes there, so she knows. But we are trying very hard to find a way to disincentivize using or encourage Massachusetts manufacturers to make sure that the rare earth minerals they purchase for purposes of making cell phones and computers and are not stolen, are not mined by slaves, and etc. Well, when we started down this road, it sounds like a great idea. It's extremely hard to do. It's extremely hard for the corporations to do. You're dealing with sovereign nations, and you're trying to find out what's going on inside those nations, and in some instances, Congo, they're lawless. Absolute lawlessness. You have no idea. And unfortunately, I will tell you that we had a women's caucus meeting, a lot of people, a lot of women there, and the people who were talking about this brought in a video, and the video showed the abuses of the slaves, many of whom were women and children. It was very, very graphic, and we had a lot of young staff. You remember this? Yeah, we had a lot of young staff there, a lot of young women who'd never seen anything like that, and it turned out to be a very challenging situation because they were very reactive to it. So we're trying to figure out how we can do that and then not send a message, because I'm on the economic development side, not send a message to corporations that we're gonna, if you come to Massachusetts, we're gonna bury you in regulations, and we're gonna require that you, a Massachusetts corporation, figure out what's going on in the Congo with rare earth minerals and who the slaves are and who the good guys are and the bad guys and how not to do this and whether it was stolen across the border and whether you're funding rebel causes. How do you do that? how do you do that to corporations doing business in Cambridge? Linda Fuller.
I just applaud all the work you're doing, Gail.
Thank you.
And there are some very good things going on in the eastern part of the state. There's a very strong feminist colloquium that occurs. And I'm really glad you're mentioning Smith, because Smith College really does probably the most on human trafficking in terms of awareness and letting people know. And I've been to several international conferences there, right here in our little Western Mass, and they really are doing some terrific things, so keep it up.
Well, keep going and keep bringing back more information to us. But these are very complicated international issues. And you know, my husband, I'm not his advertisement, but he's a law professor at Western New England University, and he teaches, among other things, international law and international human rights. And he was the lawyer for Congressman Father Robert Drinan, who was the Catholic priest who had Barney Frank's seat well before Barney Frank and was there during Watergate and all of that. And Father Drinan was an international leader on human rights. But you know, when I started talking, this is, slavery is ingrained in the culture of virtually almost every country on the face of the earth. That's how the Parthenon was built. That's how the pyramids were built. The 8 wonders of the world were built with slaves. And unfortunately, well, you conquered the country. What did you do? You enslaved the population, right? And then you built all of these 8 wonders of the world, or whatever, cathedrals. Go to Europe. How do you think the cathedrals were built? The sad part about it is, in 21st century world, in a global economy, that this is rearing its ugly head exponentially all over the globe, and that there are businesses that have as their ethic the idea that they should have slaves working for them as the cheapest possible labor. You can't get any cheaper labor than slaves, right? Mr. Perez.
Thank you. You mentioned that there is several components to the law in Massachusetts. Is anything regarding education to the public, not actually the victim of this? Because as you just said, many countries in the world consider to be servitude is fine. And when these people move to the state, I personally have talked to some of them, and they find out that it's okay. What's happening to them is fine. It's just because it's better actually back home. So it takes a learning curve to understand that in the state, no, it's not. You don't have to.
So, and this was very clearly, a point clearly made and well made in the MSNBC program last night. Most laws carve out sex workers, and most laws addressing it do not address prostitution, which the Massachusetts law does, because of the way we in this country have thought about prostitution, and it has always been presented as a victimless crime, where women choose to do this and they consent to this kind of conduct. And what exactly vitiates consent? Well, what vitiates consent obviously is being under the age of consent, or even if you're over the age of consent, if you're 18 years old, whether you're being forced under duress. Now, Karen first told us a story about a young woman who somehow got involved with someone and thought it was a diet pill and was given a very addictive, probably crack, because that's extremely addictive, and ended up having to become addicted, and now is engaging in multiple sex acts daily, so that she can feed the habit. So prostitution has always been excluded from the concept of someone who's trafficked as a sex worker. So what you gotta be to be trafficked as a sex worker is typically someone from another country who was promised work in this country, who may have even paid the traffickers a lot of money to be brought here, and then somehow was put in a massage parlor or in some other circumstance and forced to perform sex acts. But prostitution, the idea that you're a United States citizen, you're a local person, you're 13, 14 years old, and you're prostituting yourself, that was not considered trafficking, and you weren't protected under the law. So by including that type of activity in the Massachusetts law, we hope to change the dialogue and be able to prosecute not just the cartel or the gangs from other countries who are trafficking women, but to go after the street pimps, pardon my expression, to go after them too and threaten them with life imprisonment. Because some of these individuals don't have one woman they have out on the street working for them. They're threatening to kill them and their families here. Why shouldn't they be covered under the Massachusetts statute? Maybe they have 10, 15, 20 women. Why shouldn't they be covered under the Massachusetts statute? Our DA and other DAs have said the best part of the law is that we're changing the dialogue around street prostitution.
How about a round of applause for Gale
Thank
Candaras?
you, Gary.
Just in the interest of time, I'm going to turn the mic over to Sid Melcher, our executive director. But I did want to clarify one thing, and that's that Gale and I did go to law school together, but that was only a couple years ago. Sid.
Well, thank you very much, Gale. We have a gift for you.
Thank you, Sid.
And it is actually quite relevant to rare minerals. It's a copy of The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources by Michael Clare, who's a Five College professor of peace and world securities.
Thank you very
So I hope you enjoy that in your spare time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to take advantage really quickly, especially among the younger group. Anybody ever heard of Gogol Bordello? Have you heard of that group? No. Okay, well, go look for them. And they have a song called Zina Marina. Gogol Bordello is from Ukraine. And that song is about the lead singer going back to his village in Ukraine and going, well, where are these young women that used to be around here? And everybody's like, oh, they're models now. And they're not. So, thank you all for coming. Keep an eye out for our next events, and we look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.